Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 School Shooting Database. This week is the 26th anniversary of the Columbine school shooting. And it's a week where I always feel a sense of dread, as I've documented dozens, actually more than 100 different plots since Columbine that were inspired by that attack. And every time I look up information about Columbine, the same magazine cover comes up over and over in Google, and it's Time magazine from 1999 with the smiling pictures of Dylan and Eric in color looking right at you. And it's titled The Monsters Next Door. And I've thought about that cover for more than 20 years since I took an English literature class at Georgetown University. And that class was about monsters and literature, about why we talk so much about unspeakable acts of violence and what the purpose is of monsters and the monster story throughout history, throughout English literature, dating back hundreds of years and through Catholic traditions for thousands of years. So my guest on the show today is my professor from that English class that I was in 2 decades ago. Reverend Dr. Edward Ingebretsen is an expert in monsters, cultural studies. He's the author of the book At Stake, Monsters and the Rhetoric of Fear in Public Culture. So Dr. I, welcome to the show today.
Hi, David. Hello, Professor David. And I'm going to use your titles as well. Professor David, and I honor you with that title because it is yours. And I thank you for the work you do. I thank you for the attention you pay to kind of the back narrative of what we're talking about, because there's always the back narrative. And honestly, the book At Stake was initially titled Angels and Monsters, the fear of public ritual in public culture, in the sense of who's at stake. And we can call it monsters and the rhetoric, which is what we're doing. But from my background in terms of theology, in terms of literature, in terms of the way that I think and feel, what is interesting to me is the way we participate in what I'm going to call a sacrificial logic of killing. That however we want to frame it, that the week that we are focusing on demonstrates from the Hebrew Bible through to the Christian Bible about the importance of sacred killing. We're doing that this week. So I'm going to start immediately and frame that when we were talking about child sacrifice, that's embedded in the first chapter of Genesis. And the ritual of obedience called by the divine for that leads us to kind of the repeated rituals that we as a commodity end up still doing. And so that's where I come from.
I think this is a topic where when somebody sees it on the surface, they think, wait, what do monsters have to do with ritual, and why is ritual connected to a school shooting? And I think where we first came to this discussion, which we've actually been talking about this podcast and this article for, at least a year at this point, is that a cultural ritual is something that repeats over and over, and it's repeating for a reason. But most people are not aware of what that reason is. And you are a professor of literature, and literature is about examining a text and understanding the subtext, understanding the reason, understanding what purpose that author was trying to leave the reader with. And I think that in school shootings, there's not always that examination of the ritual around both the act and society's reaction to it.
Good observation. And I will start to say that the word intelligence is a textual word. It means reading between the lines. That's what the word comes from. And when one thinks about text bias, one is thinking about the way certain kinds of cloths are cut. So text and textile and the interweaving and reading between the lines is all part of the long back narrative behind that. And honestly, I'm going to focus on a different kind of population, and I'm going to say this is a ritual. It's Mark Seltzer calls it wound culture. I called it at Georgetown kind of crypto-religious in the sense of uh, much of the kind of work that I was doing around specific moments of monstrosity. There was actually predated a Columbine, most of it. I think that my particular book that you just referenced uh, came out right after Columbine, but there was work that I had done before that. But David, I want to turn it before we even talk about monster. I want to, you threw the word ritual in there, which is a good word. There is a ritual. It's a commodity ritual. I want to take you back to CNN, and maybe 10 years ago or however long ago, there was a tsunami in Asia, and so CNN wants up, "Were you there? Send us your images," which is an astonishing thing to say. It's like, we don't care how you are. The image that I would go back to, probably in the class that you had now and then I had seen you with, the image of the young child in the veldt in Africa with a predator bird sitting maybe 25 feet away. We won the Pulitzer Prize for the image, and it was a remarkable image of a child, a starving child, a child that was seriously malnourished, sitting and with an image of the bird, basically waiting for the child to die. At one particular point after the award was given, the author of the one who took the picture to take the picture made the point of, yeah, well, I waited for about 20 minutes. It took me about 20 minutes to kind of get the picture posed exactly the way that I wanted. So this is the point that I want to making is that we are creating, we're confecting, we're putting together representations. And representations have two questions that they don't ask: who made it, and why did they make it? So the question that I ask you with your podcast, and I've asked you this question before in different kinds of ways, is, who made this? I just asked that at the beginning. Is this Professor David Riedman himself, now post degree, or is this the direction that David Riedman in school did? And it's always the same. It's always the both of those. And what's the politic here? Why did you make this? I will start off by saying that wound culture, commodity culture, at stake, monsters and a rhetoric of fear, provides a structured, I'll use the word, religious light kind of word, a fetish, where we have the pleasures of killing, the observation of pain, which is also pleasurable, and consuming trauma. That, as a matter of fact, that in another article that I do, I said the real monster in the house is not the people who come in and do whatever predatory things we say that they're doing, but those of us on the other end who can't wait to read about them. There's somebody that you and I both know, and I probably have told you the story, that this particular person chased me down in the bookstore with a section from a book from American Psycho. My question to this person then, and still even now, is, if, David, all of this stuff is so unspeakable, where then the obsessive need to detail it, ritualize it, continue to speak it? Because clearly, again, our lawmakers feel very comfortable not controlling these laws. We feel very comfortable not controlling our lawmakers making these laws. And you and I can both, we can write. And we each have our different platforms, and I'm doing, I do things, and you do your own sort of thing on this. Is it some kind of I don't know what I'm going to call it, window dressing, but does the work that we do simply draw attention that prohibition is reminding? That the very act of putting into press the representation constantly reminds and brings this, the spectacle, this ritual, and it is back to the present. And my point here is, I want to move away from monster, which we haven't even talked about yet. I think it's significant. But understand that we in a sense, are still working out religious rituals that started with the Hebrew Bible and the book of Genesis that focus on obedience, loyalty, submission, Islam, Abrahamic, Christian, Judaic, Islamic, centered on their sacrificial ritual killing of children. Let me pause there.
Well, the point that you made just a moment ago was around what is the purpose of this? Are we continuing to resurface trauma for the sake of consumption? And I would say that we are trying to explore the purpose of documenting trauma for better understanding the ritual around it. And grounding this in Columbine in 1999, before social media, before broadband internet, magazines and TV news were the most important mediums. And Time magazine, was something that went to tens of millions of houses, and people would read cover to cover. So seeing this Time magazine cover from right after Columbine and deciding, you can look in the show notes, I'll have a picture of it so everybody can look at it, because it embodies everything we're discussing here. All of these decisions, as you brought up, around how somebody is portrayed, how somebody is positioned, what is the context of the story, what is the hidden message, what's the subcontext there. So you have two large pictures of the two teenagers, of Dylan and Eric. They are in color. They're both smiling. They're both looking directly at you. And the afterthought is little blurry thumbnails of the victims surrounding them. And how could you do this? How could you do this overt glorification of the two murderers? Well, it's because of the text under them. The monsters next door. We can excuse everything about glorification of violence or fetishization of violence by describing someone as a monster. So what I want to ask you is what is the origin of that term? Where did it come from?
Well, you mentioned Time magazine, so I'm going to, of course, mention the fact of another classic scene in and around the same particular period. I think it was a year or two later, in which a person accused of a homicide in a white Bronco driving up and down the streets of
Los Angeles.
You remember this, okay? So the image on Time magazine was significantly different than the person's image. Does that make sense? I'm trying not to get into the details of it, but most folks will understand of this. So that goes back to the question of Time magazine is clearly, like CNN, it's in the business for doing something. So my particular point, the point of the 2001 book, At Stake, At Stake, was that the commodity ritual is about making money. I said yesterday in my particular broadcast that someone says, "Oh, don't you, this so-and-so is happening on the news," and I'm all distressed and yada, yada, yada. I go, turn it off. Just say no. Borrow from Nancy Reagan in this case, who talked about, well, the war on drugs is easy. Just say no to them. Well, maybe. For rich people, we can say no to our drugs, possibly. But in this particular case, there is a kind of a semi-religious faux ritual in which those of us who have long shed our specific, we are probably post-church, but the habits of belief, the emotional habits of belief, because even going back to Jonathan Edwards, for the God who created you holds you like a spider over the fire. You know what? If you are snow deep in Connecticut in 1742, going to listen to Jonathan Edwards was probably as much media as you were going to get. So what they would call the Methodist circuit rider camp meetings, and you have as much entertainment in religion and structure and social community as you have in any kind of sense. So I'm taking a step aside from where you had me start on this, where we started on this. The monster as an image um, is more complicated than we say historically than Time magazine, because the monster from, again, you did this very well in your own particular reading on it, but the monster from the Latin word, which means to show, also means to warn. It's a showing, it's a warning. So if you go through, the monster of Ravenna was a misbegotten child born on the cusp of an earthquake. Anne Hutchinson, who was accused in the New England as being, an uppity woman, had a child who was born quote monstrous. Going back to Aristotle, Greek use of a word similar, teratology, suggested that women are monstrous. Again, this is a translation, okay? But that they are, because they don't replicate their parent, their male parent, they are in some way monstrous. So in that sense, monstrous is something that is off the normal, off the side, out of the center, on the margins. But remember, between you and me and whomever is listening, it's on the margins where the important writing is done. It's on the margins where things are added in, penned in, corrections that are made. So there's a significance to being on the margin. But if one is speaking about the word itself, and if we're going to, and we will come to St. Anne's use of it, where I criticize the kind of work that we both do, people will show up because we put monster in the title and they want to see the picture. My point is, yes, it's religion light. There is a pleasure for killing. We have to disown it. There is a pleasure in observing pain. We have to disown it. But the consumption of pain in this particular culture, whether it's watching Columbine fall or the constant repetition of this particular narrative, and the consuming trauma, what we call rubbernecking. So my questions are, why do we do this? What kinds of pleasures does killing have? What do we do with that? What do we do with when you stand outside and the first thing the news is going to say, how do you feel about this? Well, it's perfectly clear how the
Well, I'll pause there, because the first thing that the news will say is, this is an unspeakable act of violence. Let's speak about it.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, so I hear you, and so we're both here trying to delay on, and I'm going to move away from the actual action. Your recent one about the school killing in Dallas. For example, the word itself, monster, Time picked it up, not only but it was well in use with Time as a magazine. I wrote, as I said, I was doing my writing starting in the 80s, late 80s in this particular area, early 90s. So that particular word. But the interesting thing around that is the question that I would ask, and I asked this in your classes: who put the monster in the monstrance? If you look at Titian's image, for example, of the Annunciation, one asks, why does the angel, the angelos, the messenger, which is where that word that was taken out of my title book and put in at stake, why is the messenger from God always have to say, be not afraid? So there is something circulating here, and I call it crypto religion. You can call it religious light, but there's a notion here, and we are far from being a churched in any kind of significant kind of way. But we still shape public rituals and moments around religious habits of observing a kind of killing, paying attention to a certain kind of killing, worshiping a certain kind of killing, repeating again this notion of hang this person and nails through this person. And if you're a Catholic Christian, you're actually going to go to Good Friday, as opposed to the Protestants who think all that we do is magic, and they're right about that, I think. Or in certain countries, and even in this particular country, they're going to have reenactments of this. It's certainly crazier than the Mormons, as my friends say. Well, Mormons are crazy.
Now, for folks who are not Catholic or
Roman,
people who did not spend decades of their lives in and around Georgetown University, a Catholic school as we did, it may not be immediately apparent this connection between the monster, which we know as the horrible, the horror, the monstro in Latin, which is to show or to point out or to advise or to teach,
or to
and the
warn.
monstrance in the Catholic tradition,
Right.
which the monstrance is the large vessel. You know, it often kind of looks like a sun or a golden shield of sorts, but the bread is put into the monstrance and it's held up and displayed to the congregation. And so you have these three different words around fear and reverence and warning that all share the same roots.
Right. Yeah, I feel like I'm on to the Chuck Berry song. You talk too fast, you hurt my head. So I do apologize for that. To the if one is Catholic and one will see in a certain pre-Vatican II tradition, there would have been a large-ish, maybe 2 feet high, gold, looked like a candelabra, with a star-shaped moment around it. And then you can go back to kind of the Aztecian, you can go back to the Nazi regime's star-shaped swastika, which is what that is intending to be. So even the Catholic borrowing of this particular image itself is redolent of a kind of mythology that way predates us. But we're not going to go there. But your point is that this is what's being seen on the altar. And understand that every consecrated altar in a Catholic church has in the table bed, the stone table bed, some kind of bone of a deceased person. So I'm going to ask you, is that gross or what? Is that magic? We have basically a grave-ish sort of thing that we're sitting here. So there is at the base of all of this a whole lot of death imagery that we're trying to make some sense of. But
Well, that's the monster that we talk about, is that it has a dual nature.
right,
It's something that is attracting and repelling. It's
right.
that
Well,
the
that's
monstrance in the Catholic Church is the holy and divine and the good,
right.
but the English monster word is about that who lacks form, that who lacks social conformity, that one who sits at the edge of what's permissible in society, and
Right.
having that bone there is representing that the point where death and life meet, because that's the point where we lose understanding, where a practicing Catholic says, at the point that I die, I'm now in the hands of God. But we face this reality that the bone still exists here. There's still the horror here. Maybe the horror is that there's a duality between that life and death that's not as binary as existing here and then going up to heaven.
Well, they're right. There is no binary in nature. There isn't. Period. Full stop. In terms of even if you took 25 people, they used to do the studies on sex and gender when out of 1,000 births, 25 needed to be assigned a gender because of that. But the point that you're making, and that I get away from, because in a class I have 9 weeks to talk. Okay, and so you're better at clarifying it into 45 minutes or so. But that monster is double-sided. It's not just in the issue that I have with secular culture, if I have one, is that we are replicating our post-religious. There's a grammar of emotions that we are permitted: consumption, fear, terror, and a certain kind of pleasure. So we package everything, whether it's the man driving the Bronco down the streets, or the others, the serial killers of the late '80s. A couple of them from Virginia, different places, that people whose names they could pick them up, or these two young persons in Columbine. What you are identifying is that probably solidified the grammar of monster around a certain kind of person and a certain kind of crime. There was a chapter in that particular book to which you referred to, and I talk about Timothy McVeigh as being probably one of the first kinds of what I call domestic terrorists. And so I thought I was being, ahead of things in 2000 using that particular word. I know that particular database has just recently been, how do we say, whatever word that you want to use,
Canceled.
Is that troubling? Sure. I mean, go back to cancel. They talk about, well, woke, 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 woke. They don't know what it means. And there's a good Catholic governor of Florida who doesn't know what it means. Of course, it's scriptural. Stay awake with me and blah, 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 blah. And it comes out of the Hebrew Bible. And the authorities, Dr. Reverend King used it all of his life because it's let my people go. It's right from the early versions of the Hebrew Bible. When we're
so
talking,
we talked in some very kind of theoretical terms here around, what monster means, what its origin is, how it fits into the displays of danger versus the displays of the divine. And I think to kind of operationalize this discussion, there's a book chapter which was assigned in your course, which I took. It was the literature of monsters. I can't remember the exact title. I think a cool note on that class before we dive into it is that it's probably one of the only classes that both Patrick Ewing Sr. and Patrick Ewing Jr. both took. So you taught the NBA Hall of Famer as well as his son. But one of the assigned readings, which I did read, I don't know if either of the Ewings read, was Cohen's Monster Culture, and it's the 7 theses that he presents in that. And that's where I think this Time magazine cover starts to really, where we start to get perspective on why you would use that term and what it allows you to do with the pictures in that story. And I'm just going to read the 7 theses, and then from there we can kind of work through unpacking them. The first is that the monster's body is a cultural body. Then that the monster always escapes. The monster is the harbinger of a category crisis. The monster dwells at the gates of difference. The monster polices the borders of the possible. The fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. And finally, the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. For anybody listening, that sounds like kind of crazy gibberish, but actually each one of these really profoundly connects to the way the monster gives us permission to talk about the unspeakable act of a school shooting.
David, I'm going to push back a little bit on that. That's why I have my 4-point monster narrative, which, as I'm hearing you read that, that's kind of the way that I talk, and it drives me crazy too. 4 points. The monster comes. This is the cultural narrative. Okay, because I am still the rhetorician looking at the language of it. And if the question is, why do we have these kinds of rituals? What is this repeated cycle trying to do? What kinds of permissions is it trying to give us? There are the simple ones. It's making money for CNN and the Turner Industries. It's perfectly clear. Turner got this back with that man in the white Bronco. Okay? The monster comes from someplace far away, which is to say, whenever there is the announcement, and it is an announcement of the monster, it's always going to come, whether it's the HIV virus, whether it's mosques, or whatever the issue is, and it's the purpose.
They have to be far away, and like in the school shootings, it's the trench coat mafia, it's the goth kids, it's the mentally ill outsiders and loners and transgender.
This is the narrative. Timothy McVeigh. One of the reasons that he was so quickly put to death civically, by civic murder, was because he was one of our own. He was, if I can say it, like you, white, blue-eyed. Okay, he presented as one of the favored children of the Anglo-Saxon manifest destiny, providential 1848 narrative of that Marjorie Green is still promoting. Okay, and I use that specifically, those references, so that we have a sense of that all of these particular items lean up to Timothy McVeigh, the domestic terrorist, who was not the monster coming from far away. Number one, the monster comes from someplace far distant. Number two, the monster consumes, violates, whatever language you want, whatever the culture, and it differs from time to time. So you have to historicize the monster. The monster violates, kills, whatever the word you want, violates whatever the culture says it values. The point that we were making were mothers and children in my particular book, but the point is, the emphasis here is what the culture says it values, because it's perfectly evident that in this particular culture, to hand a teacher and their students a thing of rocks and say, defend yourself, they don't value the students, and we certainly don't value women in this culture. Number three, the monster must be killed. And number four, it cannot be my fault. So that part of the ritual that you and I are both participating in is giving people permission to continue turning David on, to continue turning Ed on, and to continue being exculpated. This isn't my fault. There's nothing I can do. Now, if we change the monster story around, now we can go back to, if you want my emendation on Cohen, whom has some good things to say, the point that CNN misses is the monster always points to what is possible. It's a warning, but it's an invitation too. So, Professor David, how do we turn this into an invitation to move beyond the recitation of the litany of death into something beyond that?
Well, that's, your 4-part monster story is the Columbine story in so many ways, that the monster comes from a distant place. It's, even though these are the kids at the school and they were, socially connected, popular kids at the school, we have to create a story that they were different, that they were other. We have to make up this fantasy of the trench coat mafia and the goth kids to take somebody who's the same and make them different.
Right.
The second piece of your story is then with Columbine, the monster destroys the children, the female teachers. Those are the most innocent people in our society. So the monster destroys the things that we covet. Then in the fourth part, the monster must die.
So much innocent, powerless.
Yes. And still are powerless in so many ways.
Right.
Then in the third piece, that the monster must die for cultural stability to return, it's less about the physical death of the monster. Both of the Columbine teenagers killed themselves there in the school. They were dead. But what we had to do is that the things that they represent need to die. That was all of the congressional hearings about Marilyn Manson and Eminem and violent video games and the loss of prayer in schools and all of the things that need to be returned for cultural stability so that another monster like this cannot be spawned. And then finally, the monster's death can't be my fault. That it wasn't any of our individual failures. It wasn't the lack of laws. It wasn't the lack of support. It wasn't any of the systems that we are part of in society that failed. It is this other, and the other died not because of me, but because of the wrong that they did. I think that's the 4 parts of your story kind of operationalized into Columbine.
Next time I teach the course, you can teach it. So then going back to Cohen's, where we started today, and I said that we both run the risk of basically returning the monster to the cartoonish version of it, is that if there is a doubleness to the monstrance, if it's not only showing but also warning, if the monster in Titian, for example, and the angel says to be, do not be afraid, this is the divine. So how is there a way of turning this conversation into a way that has some forward movement that gives you permission to move beyond a repetition of the next school shooting and gives me a repetition to re-examine my own particular narratives around this and to understand how I participate, as a fully adult person in this particular culture, of creating monstrosity and the conditions for the monstrous in this particular culture. Again, that's wordy.
Well, my answer will be equally wordy, because the reason that we're examining this is because it's a problem that has not been solved. And Columbine was not the first school shooting. There were many that led up to it that had the same types of issues that continued to be unaddressed. And in the 26 years since the Columbine attack, there have been more shootings that are more deadly at a higher frequency than there were before. And because that continues to happen, when a problem is getting worse, it's probably because there are not simple solutions to it. Complex problems don't have simple solutions. And that's where Cohen's 7 theses.
What we do, we have lawmakers who permit and encourage and legalize. It's like apartheid. It's not segregation, which is just my feeling. It's apartheid. It's law. Law participates. Law is continuing to participate. One of the things we are not doing, to our credit, and the ritual of the cinematic or the CNN or the commodity ritual that we are addressing here, which is part of the thing. If every time there was one of these events, and you notice I'm not even using the language of, whenever there was one of these events, if we simply put up the blank screen, how might that change it? Because the more we repeat it, the more we permit it.
What we're permitting is the continued surface level display, attending the service and ingesting the sacrament without ever reading the Bible.
Well, okay.
And that's where Cohen's 7 theses, if we don't understand why we're doing this, if we don't understand why we're creating monsters and why we create this same cycle of permission, both to be a monster and to kill the monster, then it's going to be a cycle that continues to repeat, because that's where this gets,
David, the people
so much deeper than the cover. Like Cohen's first thesis, the monster's body is a cultural body. That's because the monster is the anxieties and taboos and fears that society has, but people don't have agreement on how and when and where they can be addressed, or even if they should be addressed.
Agreed, I'll pause and move away to one bit. We're not killing the monster because, of course, the monster escapes. In merchandising death, as we are doing, we are continuing to, it was like those terrible moments of watching the Columbine, and again, and again, and again, and again. I'm thinking about the poor person who comes across this 20 years later and yet again is faced with this particular narrative that we are re-killing these persons. There's a sense where in our consumption and in the pleasure of both observing trauma and consuming trauma, which is what media does. And when you tell people, it makes you feel bad, turn it off. Oh, I can't do that. I need to know this. These are my real questions about this, which is why as I'm listening and I'm talking, and my hesitation, as I thought about it beforehand, of getting onto a public presentation and I said, is this the best way to think about this? And yes, it's gratifying to be remembered as somebody who wrote this and has done this kind of thing. I moved away from the Christian church in a couple of different areas. And it's clear to me that still the images of sacrifice and murder and death and offering that are part of the culture themselves have a kind of quasi ritual motion about that. Do I want to take, I now as a participant in commodity culture, which part of the pleasure of killing for me, which part of rubbernecking is permissible? Who do I want to see next being in pain? Who is the monster here? Is it the killer, the person with the weapon? We don't even call them killers anymore. We just call them shooters. No, they're killers. I mean, they people with guns.
So we don't say their names.
We don't say their names. So the delivery system to use it is problematic of how we do this, and I appreciate very much and very much in respect of the work that you do on this. One time, for example, I did something, taking actually a work from your work. For an hour and a half, all I did was read names. I had a black screen, and that's all I did. I just read the names. 2000, read the names. 2001, read the names. 2002, read the names. And I'm looking at a way of thinking about, well, I wonder whether Professor David and I could do something that would both combine the kind of the religious, the ritual moment around that I'm talking about, and the more diagnostic, data-driven work that you do, and which would move it away from monster, maybe, into a different focus. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but what we're trying to talk about is what everyone raises their hand and fusses around social media. Well, people like CNN have been doing social media for longer than we have, and it's where the work that needs to be done, and I don't know how to do that.
Well, all of your anxieties and uncertainty about where this goes or what it means or what the purpose of any of these discussions are is Cohen's second thesis, that the monster always escapes, that despite our attempts to contain or destroy it, the monster keeps reemerging because it is a persistent cultural fear that is evading permanent resolution. That's exactly what the school shooting is. That's exactly what the mass killing in a public place is that we make all of these peripheral attempts to warn that don't have any actual substance.
Well,
we create the system where somebody can do this. They have the capability and the access and the weapons and the permission and the template and the training for how to do it.
David, that's simply the CD delivery system. We are the monster. We're the one who view, who consume, who take the pleasure, and who continue.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's just to keep beating the nails on into the coffin of Cohen's his sixth thesis, that the fear of the monster is really a kind of desire.
And that's where I come back to, as I said, what is this in this for me? Who is consuming it? You go back to the first narrative in the Hebrew Bible, and the first voice you hear is a serpent. And you're going, excuse me, this is not magic. But to begin with, it says, well, evil, it's evil, it's evil. No, we are not attracted by evil. So there's some good here. There's something here. I'm sorry to say it. It's pleasurable. There's some kind of cheap, fabricated emotion that I read, or this particular person chasing me down the bookstore, wanting to read out loud a paragraph that was in all kinds of ways literally unspeakable. And the question is if all this stuff is so unspeakable, it's like American sex lies. You can talk about anyone's sex life so long as you can make it public and get people to pay for it. So all these activities that are sexually unspeakable, whatever they might be, you see my point on where that's going. I think that there's an interesting the argument the data is here. The data is clear. What we produce, because we produce the minister says, "Rest in peace to spirits who do not rest in peace," because we do not let them go. We cannot let them go. That is the issue. That in our ritual presentation of death, of wound, where we participate as the wounded, but we also participate as the wounders. Your work is calling us to a kind of acceptance that we create the situation. We are the monster. The true monster in the house is not the person who breaks in the windows. Anyway.
Well, that's because there are these paradoxes between taboos and desires, between violence and heroism, between control and powerlessness, and I think all of that kind of plays out within this school shooting narrative and cultural ritual that plays out over and over. Is people have deadly weapons that they own that are designed specifically to kill people, and it's taboo to shoot people, but it's somehow permissible to watch someone else do it.
Well, there is
especially when it's in a really vulnerable space.
And what would happen if you, as someone who produces these sorts of visual moments, what happens if you turned the whole thing into a different kind of meditation, where today's podcast are simply going to list the members of Congress who have voted on these kinds of bills, on these kinds of acts. That's all we're going to do is just read them and read them and read them and read them and read them. In other words, where we're not participating in continuing a kind of voyeurism. There is something deeply sadistic about the whole activity. And everyone can say no, but, but as a matter of fact, the position of the observer and the position of the doer are in very many ways parallel and similar. In wound culture, something that is private becomes a public moment in which all of us are rubbernecking and taking some kind of pleasure that we're going to deny. And beyond that, I don't know where else to go with this. But it's in the sense of saying is that what in my own particular life is a kind of a walkaway or takeaway, I would say, find the object or person or place that in my life is monstrous, that both shows me something, that invites me something, that invites me to something possible. And I do think that this is inviting you and me and your readership and listenership into a space beyond this, because the simple litany and the recitation of the scene of the monster escapes that, because that's not the monster.
Well, thinking more across American history, is we are a culture of deep anxiety and deep guilt about any time that we engage with what we determine to be taboo or dangerous, and thinking to colonial times and the anxiety about the indigenous people and the danger of crossing the walls from the village into the woods at night, into the developing America, and the fear of immigrant groups, the fear of other religions, the fear of identity. Thinking in more modern terms in history, in World War II, after World War II, we had to be scared of the communists. As the wall fell, suddenly we had these domestic things to worry about. We had to worry about child kidnappers. We had to worry about serial killers, something which is extraordinarily rare, but has thousands of TV shows about serial killers in the 80s and 90s. Then 9/11 comes and we have to fear terrorists. We have to fear Islam. But that's a very a very short actual threat. There have been barely any terrorist attacks domestically or targeting the West since then. And it's almost like we had to funnel a new area for our cultural anxiety, and that became the school shooter and the active shooter, because we as Americans don't know how to be a culture that's not defined by constant anxiety.
I don't disagree, but what you keep pointing to in even the language in the text, the verb tenses that you're using, is something that is created for us, because all the narratives that you've been talking about in terms of child this and this, that, and other thing, and if we go back to the actual histories of this particular country, David, it is not our presence here, the European presence here, has not done good things for those who were originally here. And that keeping America white again was by King George's royal proclamation in 1763, this little squiggle of land on the east side of the border, and that the rest of this was not white. But rather than getting into the statistics around genocide and colonial enslavement of the indigenous, etc., what you articulate well is that from every age there has been a narrative that has been created for us, that into which we participate. When Frederick Douglass on the 4th of July says, to what good for an enslaved person, he used the word slave, is the 4th of July. So you're inviting us here to ask ourselves, given the current regime, and I call it that particular regime, we invited this, period. Oh, no, but. So if there's going to be a way forward, if the monster warns but also invites, the category crisis is one. We have this thing around categories. Perhaps we need to be freer with categories. And I don't, and I know that our time today is probably coming to an end, but the work that you are doing articulates very deeply the systemic way in which there's a way of trying to find a way. Someone yesterday, in a thing that I did, said, well, I feel like I've been usurped. And this was a person who for 4 weeks had not had a word to say. And I said, if there's any usurping going along in this particular culture, it takes two to violate boundaries. One, not to set the boundary, and someone to walk past and through that particular boundary. Not finger pointing, Professor David, at you, Professor Ed. Yes, I can do that on my own. So how do we move away from the ritual, commercial rights of participating in these ritual killing acts? I don't know. I don't know how to do that, except to say that, as a matter of fact, our lawmakers, and they go, oh, no, it's not about gun ownership. Gun ownership, the Second Amendment was about keeping enslaved persons in place, period. So if we want to start talking our history and the formation of the Caucasian democracy, where the first 4 presidents of the accidental separation, and the reason the U.S. separated from Britain, or the colonies separated from Britain, because the legal laws of the colonies no longer matched those of Britain around enslavement, period. That all King George had to do was come in and say, nope, stopping all this. Anyway, sorry.
Well, I mean, the takeaway from this is, what's the purpose of the monster? Why do we see it so many times, and why do millions of other people see that on the cover of a magazine or see it in a description of the most recent attack? And once you see something labeled as a monster, you no longer have to be responsible for it. Oh. Like, the monster is the vessel of our fears, our failures, our fascinations. But people don't realize that that's what that word means. And as soon as we say monster, we can immediately distance ourselves from responsibility and remove all of the
But they do
complexity.
see, they go, oh, this is monster, so this is going to be more horror TV. I'm going to get the church light without any of the church.
Yes, so until we accept and understand what this term and what this cultural ritual means, because it's a ritual that's absolving us, not of doing anything to address the fundamental drivers of violence. All we're doing is removing responsibility. And all we're
And
doing is
admitting,
simplifying complexity. And we need to acknowledge that to make any more progress towards either fixing this or avoiding the creation of whatever the next monster will be.
okay, I agree with you, and I think that probably that's a decent place to end Cohen's thesis. Cohen's seven or arguments. The and you have it before you, so you have the better words for it. The monster stands at the gate of the possible. What he's referring to there is the Edenic narrative of the angel and the sword, with Adam and Eva, the woman, who's being driven out into the world. So the gates of the possible, my friend, are you and me and where we live and how we live. And uh, the monster will always escape us, but we will always produce narratives around the escape. Because, as a matter of fact, they are easily consumed. They give us the walkaway sense that we have. It's like Blinkist. It gives us a shorthand version of, oh, I can read this book in 12 minutes. I'm guessing that persons who listen and read you have a vested, from the word invest, put into an investment in some sort of answer or category solution. I don't know that there is one. I don't. I think that short of the fact that this particular culture values money, this particular culture has, over the last 30 or 40 years, put persons into government who value money, who really don't want to pass laws for persons of color, persons underage, persons of a certain generation, persons of a certain gender. That if you look at the real cost and the real money of what someone's salary is, this seems like a far stretch from what you're talking about. Is we don't value persons in any other kind of way. Here's a bucket of rocks. Protect yourself.
And I think that that can kind of come full circle to where we started with, why do we have the Columbine school shooters instead of the Columbine murderers, or the names Dylan and Eric, the people, the members of society who committed this act of murder in this place? Why do we define things with obscure terms like the name of a town, or school shooter, or active shooter, or mass shooter? And that's because none of this is about the crime per se. It's all about creating and conjuring a figure. And that figure isn't grounded in anything. It's a figure that's meant to evoke anxieties. It's a figure that's meant to evoke these archetypes
Conjure is a
about.
good magical word for it. Thank you, sir. And what? There will always be somebody to read the next chapter. Now, is that actually doing the work that we wanted to do? That's for both you and I and others who work around these materials to think about, and to, as my husband, said, well, should we go participate in, the rally for this or for that? And I say, oh, no, it's too much work and I can't. So are there things that you and I can do here? We both have done different sorts of things. I have taken my own suggestion. I've simply read the names with a black screen. I put my vote not where. I mean, you and I both do these kinds of things. But what CNN does, what social media is going to do. Now, do we have an answer for that? And perhaps that may be the direction that Professor Riedman's blog wants to go. Let's look at how social media itself amplifies the echo chamber of the monster.
I think the only way that we can really wrap this up,
Yes.
because just like the monster always escapes and the monster always returns, we aren't going to have any neat and clear conclusion to any of this. So I just want to read the very last sentence of the paper that we wrote together. And it's, in the end, perhaps these terms exist not to describe what happened, but to narrate what we fear might happen again, while absolving ourselves from responsibility for the monster we all helped to create.
Professor David, I will say that you wrote that article. It's a very good article. I am privileged to be part of the work that you do ongoingly. I was serious about thinking, how would David and I do something like this that moved it away from either what the work that both of us do? That's an invitation, and perhaps we should think about that. But I
And
will say,
sometimes we might fail even when we set out with the most noble of attempts to
David,
bring some sense to this.
we fail always, which is why we do it again.
And the monster will always be back,
Okay.
which I will be again next week.
All right.
So Dr. Ingebretsen, thank you so much for your time today. And the link to our article is in the show notes, as well as your books and papers.
Assalamu alaikum, peace to you, and good spiritual week for those who in either the Hebrew tradition or the Christian, and the rest of the world, all of us, be at peace in the universe, and we will make it better together.